hadn't planned to stay in the cabin. I had no intention of spending the weekend alone in the middle of nowhere. But when my friend pulled out last minute and I couldn't get a refund, I found myself driving to that remote cabin in the mountains. It was meant to be a quick getaway. I thought I'd find peace and quiet, just some time to clear my head. But from the moment I arrived, things didn't feel right. The cabin was old, one of those places built in the 1970s, tucked between dense trees with a view of the mountains in the distance. The road leading to it was gravel, rough and uneven, not the kind of road you want to drive on at night. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long, twisted shadows across the property. I parked and took in the sight of the place. The wood was dark, almost black, with peeling paint and overgrown vines creeping up the walls. The porch creaked when I stepped onto it, and the door was slightly ajar, as if waiting for me to walk in. I frowned, thinking maybe the cleaning crew hadn't locked up properly, but I shrugged it off. People forget things all the time, especially when they're busy. I stepped inside, and the smell hit me immediately. It wasn't just the musty scent of an old building. It was something else, something sharp like mold or damp wood. The air felt thick, almost oppressive. I glanced around. The living room had a large stone fireplace that seemed like it could swallow the entire room. There were old, worn-out sofas, a few rickety chairs, and a table that looked like it had been through more than its fair share of dinner parties. I set my bags down in the corner and went to check the kitchen. The fridge was old but functional, though it seemed to hum louder than it should. The countertops were cluttered with odds and ends, and the cabinets had a slightly unsettling creak when I opened them. Nothing out of the ordinary, though, and nothing that immediately sent alarm bells ringing. I decided to make myself comfortable. The whole place seemed a bit run down, but I wasn't here for luxury. I just wanted to relax. I made a cup of tea and settled on the couch, flipping through a book I'd brought along. But something gnawed at me, the silence. It was too quiet, even for a cabin in the woods. There were no birds, no distant sounds of animals, nothing but the soft whir of the fridge and the occasional rustle of wind outside. As I sat there, the evening grew darker, and the shadows inside the cabin stretched across the walls, turning them into strange shapes. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it was hard to ignore. It was as if the house itself was watching me. I'd heard about isolated cabins like this one, stories of people getting lost or going mad because of the isolation. But that was all it was, stories. I didn't believe in anything supernatural, and I wasn't about to start now. I turned on the small TV in the corner, trying to drown out the creeping discomfort. The static buzzed for a few seconds before it cleared, and I flipped through a few channels, not really paying attention to anything. That's when I heard it, a faint tapping sound, like someone knocking lightly on the door. My heart skipped a beat. I couldn't tell if it was real or just my mind playing tricks. The sound came again, a soft, rhythmic knock, then silence. I stood up, my legs suddenly heavy, and walked over to the door. I looked through the peephole, but there was nothing, just the porch and the dark woods beyond. No person, no animal, nothing. I felt a slight shiver run through me, but I brushed it off. It was probably just the wind, or maybe a branch scraping against the door. I locked the door and turned back to the living room, but as I did, I noticed something strange. The window at the back of the cabin, which I was sure had been closed earlier, was now wide open. The curtain was blowing in the breeze. I didn't remember opening it, and I couldn't figure out how I hadn't noticed it earlier. My pulse quickened, and I stood frozen for a few seconds, just staring at the open window. I walked over and closed it, locking it in place. The cold air that had crept in left a chill on my skin, and I pulled the blanket tighter around me as I sat back down. But the feeling of unease wouldn't leave. I tried to focus on the TV again, but my mind kept wandering. The shadows in the room seemed to grow longer, darker. The wind outside began to howl louder, shaking the windows and making the trees creak. I kept hearing the knocks. Every few minutes they came, soft but persistent. My nerves were on edge, and I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something. Someone. Standing in the doorway, but every time I checked, it was empty. The silence that followed felt worse than the knocking itself. It was as if I was waiting for something I couldn't see, something that wasn't quite right. Around midnight, I decided to go to bed. I didn't feel comfortable, but I figured the best way to deal with this was to sleep through it. I locked all the doors and windows again, checking them twice before crawling into the bed. The bed was firm, the sheets a little rough, but it was a bed, and I needed to rest. I turned off the lamp and closed my eyes, hoping that sleep would come quickly. But it didn't. The knocking continued, but this time it was louder, more forceful. It was as if someone was banging on the door, demanding to be let in. My heart raced, and I sat up in bed, staring at the door across the room. I wanted to ignore it, to pretend it was just the wind or the house settling. But the sound wasn't random. It had a pattern, a rhythm that seemed deliberate. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and stood up, my legs shaky beneath me. I walked to the door slowly, hesitating, every step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the door, I pressed my ear to it, listening. The knocking had stopped, but there was something else. Something faint, like a scratching sound, coming from the walls. It was as if something was inside, moving behind the thin layers of plaster. My breath caught in my throat, and I pulled away from the door, backing into the room. I had to leave. I grabbed my things quickly, heart pounding in my chest, and rushed to the front door. But as I reached for the handle, it wouldn't open. My mind raced. Why wasn't it opening? I yanked harder, but it was like the door was stuck. Or worse, like something was holding it shut on the other side. The scratchy noise was growing louder, now coming from the walls, from the floor beneath me, from everywhere. The air felt thick, suffocating. I pulled away from the door and glanced around the room, looking for another way out. The back window, the one I had closed earlier, was still wide open. I ran to it, pushing the curtain aside, and found that the ground below was too far to jump. There was no way I could make it out without hurting myself. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing. The knocking started again, louder this time, and the floor beneath my feet groaned as if something, or someone, was moving beneath it. I had to do something. I backed away from the window, my breath shallow, and turned toward the kitchen. The back door, the one I hadn't checked, was there. I sprinted toward it, grabbing the handle, and it turned. It opened. I didn't stop to look back. I ran out into the cold night air, my heart pounding in my chest. The cabin loomed behind me, its dark windows watching me as I stumbled down the gravel road, not daring to look back. I didn't know what had happened, what had been knocking, or what had been in the walls, but I wasn't about to stay and find out. By the time I reached the car, I didn't care to check if anything was following me. I drove away without a second thought. I don't know what I experienced that night, but the one thing I'm sure of is that the cabin didn't want me there. It didn't want anyone there, and I'll never go back. It had been one of those weeks, heavy rain, work piling up, stress eating at me like a slow burn. The kind of week where even the thought of seeing another person felt exhausting. So when I found this cabin, deep in the woods, tucked away from everything, I knew I needed it. A weekend alone, no distractions, just time to breathe. I didn't think much about the location when I booked it online. It had great reviews, looked charming, and there was a fireplace. That was all I needed. Driving out there, the city felt like it was slipping further and further behind me. The roads narrowed, becoming rougher and less traveled. until even my GPS couldn't keep up. The rain was still falling, relentless. The wipers on my car couldn't seem to wipe fast enough. The kind of rain that makes everything seem just a little bit more surreal. After about an hour of winding, barely visible roads, I saw it. A small, isolated cabin, sitting quietly in the woods. The porch light flickered against the dark, wet trees. There was no one else around. It felt like the entire forest had swallowed the road leading here. I pulled up, grabbed my bag, and took a quick look around. The trees were so dense, it felt like I was in a different world. The only sounds were the steady thrum of rain and the occasional creak of the trees swaying in the wind. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the hinges groaning. Inside, it was everything I wanted: cozy, warm, and simple. A small wooden living room with an old-fashioned fireplace. A couple of mismatched chairs, a table, and a thick rug. The kitchen was compact, but well-equipped. It was a far cry from the stress of my daily life, and I felt the tension in my shoulders start to ease. But something wasn't right. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. It was the way the silence felt too thick, the way the air seemed just a little heavier than it should have been. Maybe it was just the isolation, or the fact that I hadn't been alone in nature for so long. I shook it off, telling myself it was just nerves. I unpacked my things, stoked the fire, and started making a simple dinner. The rain was still hammering on the roof, but I felt comfortable, safe in the little bubble of warmth I had created. It wasn't until I started to settle in for the night that things started to feel off. I'd set up my sleeping bag on the couch, planning to fall asleep to the crackling fire, but every time I tried to relax, I felt a sharp discomfort in my chest. My eyes kept darting to the windows. The rain outside was now more of a downpour, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The first time it happened, I chalked it up to my imagination. There was a soft, almost imperceptible tapping on the window. I stood up quickly, my heart racing, but there was nothing there. Just rain pouring down in sheets, the night stretching out beyond the glass. I tried to laugh it off. It was just the wind, I thought, or maybe an animal brushing against the window. But as I sat back down, it happened again. This time louder, sharper. A tap, tap, tap right against the glass. I froze. My heart skipped. My first thought was that it was a person, but who would be out here, especially in this storm? No one. It was absurd. I stood up slowly, walking toward the window. The rain blurred the outside world, and I couldn't see anything beyond the dark, wet trees. I stayed by the window for a few minutes, my mind running through all kinds of possibilities, none of them comforting. I wanted to go to bed, forget about it, but my body wouldn't let me. The feeling of being watched didn't go away. Eventually, I made my way to the bedroom. It felt like the kind of room where, if I kept my eyes closed, I could convince myself it was safe. The bed was small but comfortable, and I pulled the thick blankets up around my shoulders. The warmth of the fire was still with me, wrapping me in a comforting haze. But sleep didn't come. The tapping came again, this time from the direction of the front door. My heart was pounding now, and my mind was racing with possibilities. Was someone out there? Was I imagining it? What should I do? Should I check? But I didn't want to leave the safety of the room. I lay still, straining to hear, every little creak of the cabin setting me on edge. The tapping persisted. It didn't stop. I thought about calling someone, but who would I even call out here? There was no cell service, no signal at all. My phone was just a dead weight in my pocket. I had to check, couldn't ignore it. I grabbed a flashlight, took a deep breath, and stood up. The air was colder now, and the fire felt distant. My footsteps felt too loud as I walked through the dark cabin, the sound of the rain intensifying as I neared the door. The tapping didn't stop, but I noticed it was coming in a pattern now. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, pause. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to hide. They were taunting me. I reached for the door handle, but just as my hand brushed it, a loud, deafening crash came from the back of the cabin. It sounded like someone had thrown a rock or something heavy against the wall. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The tapping on the door stopped immediately. I turned slowly, my heart thudding in my chest. I couldn't see anything from the back of the cabin, just the dim light from the flashlight reflecting off the wooden walls. But I knew there was something or someone out there. The room felt smaller now. The walls seemed to close in on me. My skin was crawling, but I forced myself to move. Slowly, I crept toward the back door, shining the flashlight over the floorboards, the corners, the window that faced the woods. There was nothing, no sign of what had caused the noise. I considered my options. I could run. I could grab my things and head back down the mountain in the middle of the night, but that felt just as dangerous as staying. There was something unsettlingly final about this place, like it had its own rules. I stayed, pacing back and forth in the cabin, unsure of what to do next. The rain didn't stop, poured and poured, beating on the windows like a drum. The storm didn't let up, and I felt the weight of isolation pressing harder on me. By morning, the storm was still raging, but I had finally fallen asleep, exhausted from the anxiety and adrenaline. I woke to a silence so sudden it was jarring. The storm had passed, the rain gone, the sky clear. When I stepped outside to get some air, I noticed something that made my stomach churn. The path leading up to the cabin was dotted with footprints. Not just one set, multiple. The tracks were fresh, and they went all the way up to the porch. My blood ran cold as I looked at the marks in the mud. Whoever had been out there wasn't some random stranger. They had been watching me, and they'd been close enough to leave their mark on the ground. I didn't stay long enough to look around more. I grabbed my bag, jumped in the car, and drove back down the mountain, my hands shaking on the wheel. I couldn't get out of there fast enough. I never went back to that cabin, and I never found out who had been out there in the woods. But I learned one thing. Some places, no matter how peaceful they seem, hold more than just the memories of their past. They hold something else, something waiting. I don't know why I agreed to it in the first place. Maybe I thought I needed the break, or maybe I was just trying to prove something to myself. Either way, I regretted it the second I arrived. The cabin was deep in the woods, far from anything. My friend Mark had offered it to me when I mentioned wanting some time alone. He had inherited it from his uncle, an old hunter who had lived out here until he passed away. I should have asked more about it before I agreed. The drive took longer than expected. The dirt road twisted through the forest, and the deeper I went, the less maintained it became. By the time I reached the clearing, my car was covered in dust, and I had already decided I wouldn't be staying long. The cabin itself was small and old. The wood was dark, almost black in places, and the porch sagged slightly in the middle. There were no neighbors, no lights, just trees stretching endlessly in every direction. The air was thick and damp, filled with the constant hum of insects. I stepped out of the car and took a deep breath, already feeling like I had made a mistake. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood and dust. The furniture was basic: a small couch, a wooden table, and a single bed pushed against the far wall. There was a fireplace, but I had no intention of using it. A small kitchen area took up one corner, complete with an old gas stove and a fridge that looked like it hadn't worked in years. Mark had assured me there was running water, but the pipes groaned in protest when I turned the faucet on. I spent the first hour unpacking and trying to get comfortable. There was no cell service, which I expected, but it still unsettled me. I told myself I would read, maybe take a few walks, clear my head. But as the sun started to set, I realized how isolated I really was. The forest around the cabin was dense. The trees grew close together, their branches tangled like veins. As the light faded, shadows stretched across the ground, and the sounds of the woods changed. The usual birdsong disappeared, replaced by something else, something I couldn't quite place. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, the occasional low groan of shifting wood. I told myself it was just the forest settling for the night, but it didn't feel right. I locked the door and double-checked the windows. The only light inside came from a small lamp on the table, casting long shadows against the walls. I sat on the couch and tried to read, but my eyes kept drifting toward the window. Every so often, I thought I saw movement between the trees, but when I looked directly, there was nothing. Around midnight, I heard something outside, a soft, deliberate crunch of leaves. Then another. Footsteps. I sat up, my body tense. The sound stopped. I held my breath, listening. The cabin was completely silent, but I could feel it. Someone or something was out there. I stood slowly, moving toward the window. The darkness outside was thick, swallowing everything beyond the porch. I couldn't see anything, but I knew I wasn't alone. My hands were shaking as I reached for the old hunting knife Mark had left in the kitchen. I gripped it tightly and waited. Then the footsteps started again. Closer this time. Slow, careful steps circling the cabin. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. They wanted me to know they were there. I moved to the door, pressing my ear against the wood. My own heartbeat was so loud it nearly drowned out everything else. But I heard it breathing, just on the other side. A deep, slow inhale, then silence. I backed away, knife still in hand. My mind raced. Should I shout? Turn off the light? Try to run? None of those seemed like good options. I stood frozen, every nerve in my body screaming at me to do something. Anything. And then a knock. Soft, almost polite. I nearly dropped the knife. I didn't answer. I didn't move. My breath was shallow, barely there. Another knock. Then another. Steady. Unhurried. I forced myself to move, inching toward the window again. The porch was empty, but something felt wrong, like the darkness itself was shifting, pressing closer. The knocking stopped. Then a whisper. My name. My blood turned to ice. I didn't stay to find out what happened next. I grabbed my bag, my keys, and bolted for the door. My hands fumbled with the lock, my breath coming in ragged gasps. As soon as the door swung open, I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. The trees closed in around me as I sprinted to my car. The silence in the woods felt suffocating. I yanked the door open, jumped inside, and locked it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life and I slammed my foot on the gas. As I sped down the dirt road, something caught my eye in the rearview mirror. The porch light flickered, just for a second. Then, in the darkness, movement. A figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching me leave. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something had followed me. I never told Mark the full story. I just said the cabin wasn't for me and left it at that. He didn't press me for details, and I didn't offer any. I don't know what was out there that night. I don't want to know. But sometimes, when I'm alone, I still hear the knocking, still hear my name whispered in the dark. And I wonder if whatever was in those woods ever really let me go. I hadn't intended to go to the cabin that weekend. It was meant to be a relaxing getaway, just me and the solitude of the forest. I'd been needing a break for weeks, and after a rough stretch at work, I thought a couple of days in the woods would help me clear my head. The cabin wasn't much, just a small, simple structure nestled deep in the woods about 2 hours from town. It wasn't luxurious by any means, but it was cozy, with a wood stove for warmth and a little stream nearby for peace and quiet. I'd rented it from a friend of a friend, a place they had used for years. "It's perfect," they'd said. "You'll love it." I took their word for it. The drive up wasn't bad, just a winding road through dense trees and hills. The weather had been a bit iffy, but nothing that seemed too concerning. The sky was overcast, and a light drizzle began to fall as I made my way through the last stretch of dirt road leading to the cabin. When I arrived, it was quiet, too quiet. The trees around the cabin were tall, their branches heavy with moisture. A few birds chirped in the distance, but aside from that, it felt like the whole world was holding its breath. I unloaded my car, grabbed the few things I needed, and made my way inside. The wooden door creaked on its hinges as I pushed it open. It smelled of pine and earth inside, like the forest had seeped into the walls. The cabin was just as I expected, simple but functional. A small living room with a couple of mismatched chairs, a stove in the corner, a small kitchen area, and a loft above where the bed was. I'd brought a book and some snacks to last me through the weekend, planning to spend most of my time reading, maybe doing some light hiking if the weather cleared up. The first night was peaceful. The sound of the rain against the roof was oddly comforting. I made a fire in the stove, cooked a quick dinner, and settled in for a quiet evening. But as the night deepened, the air grew thicker. The wind picked up outside, the trees groaning and swaying. It wasn't enough to be alarming, but it felt off. There was something about the isolation that was starting to get to me that I tried not to let it bother me. I told myself I was just being paranoid. After all, it was just a cabin in the woods, nothing unusual. The fire crackled, the shadows danced on the walls, and I sat back in my chair, reading for a while until I fell asleep. It wasn't until the middle of the night that I woke up, feeling something was wrong. At first, I couldn't place it, but then I noticed it. The silence. The wind had stopped. The rain had stopped. The usual nighttime sounds, the rustling of leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl, even the distant barking of some animal were all gone. It was so quiet, it felt suffocating. I lay there in the dark, straining to hear something, anything, but there was nothing. The stillness was overwhelming. After what felt like hours, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to check the cabin to make sure everything was fine. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag and crept downstairs. The beam of light swept across the room, illuminating the worn wooden floorboards. Nothing seemed out of place, but the uneasy feeling hadn't left me. I stepped outside onto the porch, the cool air hitting my face. It was so still, I could hear my own breath. I shone the flashlight across the yard, scanning the area, but there was no sign of movement, nothing but trees. Yet something didn't feel right. I stood there for a few minutes trying to shake off the tension. There was no reason to be scared. I was just being ridiculous. The wind would pick up again, and everything would be fine. But then I heard something, a faint rustling in the trees. It was hard to pinpoint where exactly it was coming from, but it was there, just a slight movement, a soft scrape against the underbrush. My heart skipped a beat. I strained to listen, trying to determine if it was an animal or something else. The rustling stopped. Silence returned. I stood frozen, my breath shallow, trying to convince myself that it was nothing, just the wind or a small animal. But deep down, I knew I wasn't alone. Someone or something was out there. I quickly went back inside and locked the door behind me. I grabbed my phone and checked the signal. Nothing. Of course, there wouldn't be any cell service out here, but I had hoped. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it was just nerves. I could get through the weekend. It was probably just a deer or some other animal. Nothing to worry about. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds chirping. The morning light filtered through the small windows, casting a warm glow across the room. The silence from the night before was gone. replaced by the usual sounds of the forest. I spent most of the day outside, walking around the cabin and the small trails nearby. I had hoped the fresh air would clear my head, but the sense of unease hadn't completely left me. It lingered in the back of my mind, gnawing at me. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the leaves, made me jump. That evening, I made another fire, sat down with a book, and tried to relax. But as the sun set, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the quiet from the night before, it was the whole place. The isolation, the way the trees seemed to close in around the cabin. The shadows outside seemed to grow longer, and every gust of wind felt more like a whisper, like something was watching me. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again, footsteps. This time they were closer. I froze, straining to listen. I wasn't imagining it. There were footsteps outside the cabin. Slowly, deliberately, as if someone was walking just out of sight, circling the cabin. My pulse quickened, and I stood up, quietly moving toward the window. I peeked through the curtains, shining the flashlight out into the dark. There was nothing, just the trees swaying gently in the wind. I scanned the area again, feeling my breath catch in my throat. Still nothing. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't just ignore it anymore. Someone or something was out there. I went to the front door and locked it. Then I checked the back door, the windows, making sure everything was secure. But that feeling of being watched didn't go away. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the couch, eyes darting to every sound, every movement outside the cabin. But no one came. The next morning, I decided I had enough. I couldn't stay here another night, not with that constant feeling of being watched, not with the strange noises. I packed up my things, grabbed my keys, and drove away as quickly as I could, barely looking back. As I drove down the dirt road, I couldn't help but glance at the trees, at the cabin in the distance. It looked peaceful from afar, serene even. But I knew the truth. It was the isolation that made it feel unnatural. The sense that something was lurking, just beyond sight, waiting. I told myself I'd never go back, but the feeling never really left. Every time I find myself alone in the woods, I hear the footsteps again, just on the edge of my hearing. It's not a sound I'll ever forget. And that's why I'll never return to that cabin. Not in a million years. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend. Just me, the woods, and the kind of solitude you can only find in a cabin that's miles away from anyone else. I had rented it online, thinking it would be the perfect way to escape the chaos of city life. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, just me and the trees. The photos of the cabin made it look rustic, cozy, just what I needed. The reviews mentioned a few odd things here and there, but nothing that made me hesitate. Perfect for a weekend retreat, one review said. Great for people looking to disconnect. That was exactly what I was looking for. The drive out was longer than I expected, but I didn't mind. The road twisted and turned, narrow and winding, until it felt like I was driving deeper into the forest. It was an odd kind of silence out there, the kind that presses on you from all sides. I passed a few old barns and distant houses, but there was no one around, just endless rows of trees and the occasional bird swooping overhead. When I finally reached the cabin, I had that same feeling you get when you realize you're more isolated than you thought, but I brushed it off. It was just a cabin in the woods, after all. It was what I had come for. The cabin itself was simple, wooden, with a slanted roof and a small porch. It looked like it had been there for decades, maybe longer. The porch was old and creaky, the kind of place where you could picture yourself sitting with a cup of coffee, watching the sunrise. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the air heavy with the smell of pine and old wood. Everything looked like it had been taken care of, nothing fancy but well maintained. A stone fireplace sat opposite the front door, with a couple of chairs around it. The kitchen was small but functional, and the one bedroom upstairs was modest, with a window that overlooked the trees. I set my bag down and felt a strange sense of calm, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The first few hours were peaceful. I spent some time unpacking, making a simple dinner, and wandering around the property. There was a small stream nearby, and the sound of water running over rocks was calming. I walked along the bank for a while, watching the ripples and letting my thoughts drift. I didn't even notice the sun setting until the sky turned orange and pink, the first few stars beginning to peek through. As night fell, I went back inside, stoked the fire in the fireplace, and settled in with a book. The wind picked up outside, making the trees creak and groan in the distance. I could hear small animals rustling through the underbrush, but other than that, the night was completely still. It felt good to be so far removed from everything. I was just about to settle into my chair with a glass of wine when I heard a noise. It was faint at first, almost like a tapping. I thought it might be a branch hitting the side of the cabin, but then it came again, louder this time. I set my wine down and stood up, straining to listen. It was coming from the back of the cabin, near the woods.
Top, top, top.
A slow, steady rhythm that sent a strange chill through my body. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a squirrel, something looking for food. But it didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. It was almost deliberate. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and made my way to the back door. My heart was beating faster now, not out of fear, but out of the instinctive worry that something wasn't right. I flicked the flashlight on and stepped outside, scanning the dark yard. The beam of light cut through the blackness, revealing nothing but trees and the occasional rustle in the underbrush. The tapping had stopped. I told myself it was nothing. A branch, a gust of wind, but my gut told me otherwise. The woods were too quiet, too still. As I turned to head back inside, I caught a glimpse of something in the trees. A shadow, something that didn't quite belong. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The shadow moved, just out of sight, slipping between the trunks of the trees. It wasn't an animal. I could tell that much. Whatever it was human. For a moment, I thought I was imagining things, but the tapping noise started again, this time coming from the woods, the same slow, rhythmic sound. My pulse quickened. I couldn't see anyone, but I knew someone, or something, was out there. I ran back inside, bolting the door behind me, my hands shaking. I stood there, staring out the window into the darkness, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The night dragged on and nothing else happened. The tapping stopped, and the woods fell back into their eerie quiet. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that I was overreacting. It was a long drive and I'd probably had too much wine, but something didn't feel right. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The fire eventually died down, and I decided to turn in for the night. I made my way upstairs, trying to ignore the tension in my chest, and crawled into bed. The sheets were soft, and the cool air from the window helped me drift off to sleep. But just as I was starting to relax, I heard something again. This time it was louder, a bang, followed by a scraping sound, like something heavy dragging across the ground. I shot up in bed, my heart racing. It wasn't just tapping anymore. This was something else, something deliberate, something close. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and crept to the window. I tried to steady my breathing, peering into the darkness, but all I could see were shadows. The noise came again, followed by a strange shuffling sound. I had no idea what it was, but it was closer than before. I didn't think twice. I grabbed my things, threw on a jacket, and ran outside, not bothering to check the back door this time. I had to get away from the cabin. The woods weren't safe. I didn't know what I was running from, but I knew I needed to leave. Fast. I stumbled through the trees, the flashlight trembling in my hand, my mind racing with panic. I couldn't hear anything over the pounding of my heart, but I could feel eyes on me, watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. The forest felt different now, the silence suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted, and every rustle in the leaves made me jump. I wasn't sure how far I'd gone, but the darkness felt endless, and my legs burned from running. It was only when I tripped over a root and fell to the ground that I realized I had lost my bearings. I couldn't see the cabin, couldn't see the road, nothing familiar at all. My flashlight flickered out, plunging me into total darkness. Panic surged in my chest. I had to keep moving. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the rocks and branches that scraped at my skin. Then I heard it, the sound of footsteps, heavy, steady, coming closer. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My breath hitched in my throat as I turned, trying to peer into the blackness. I couldn't see anyone, but I could feel them. The presence, the weight of it, pressing in on me. I started to back up, moving as silently as I could, praying I wasn't heard. Just as I was about to bolt, the moon broke through the clouds, casting a pale light over the forest floor. And that's when I saw it. A figure, tall, broad-shouldered, standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me. My heart skipped a beat. I froze. I didn't know what to do. My legs wouldn't move. My mind couldn't process what was happening. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, as if waiting for me to make the first move. After what felt like an eternity, the figure stepped back, melting into the darkness, leaving me standing there, breathing heavily, utterly confused. I didn't wait to find out what would happen next. I ran, fast. I didn't stop until I stumbled back to the road, far enough away from the cabin that I could finally catch my breath. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed by the side of the road, too scared to go back to the cabin, too scared to look behind me. By morning, I called a tow truck, and they helped me get my car out of there. I didn't tell them what had happened. I couldn't explain it. I just wanted to leave. When I got back to the city, I checked the cabin listing online again. The page had been taken down. There were no reviews anymore. Nothing. It was like the cabin had never existed at all. I haven't gone back to the woods since, and I don't think I ever will. But every now and then, when the wind is still and the night is quiet, I hear the tapping again, soft and slow, echoing from the trees. And I know I'll never escape it. I've always thought of myself as someone who enjoys solitude, a break from the noise of the world, just me and my thoughts. So when I found that small cabin in the woods for rent, it seemed like the perfect opportunity to get away, clear my head, and enjoy a few days in peace. I wasn't expecting much, just a small, secluded place to escape to. But as soon as I arrived, I felt something strange, an uneasy feeling I couldn't quite shake off. The cabin itself wasn't much. It sat in the middle of a dense forest, miles away from any neighbors or main roads. The gravel driveway was overgrown with weeds, and the wood of the cabin had the dull, grayish hue of age and neglect. I wasn't worried, though. I was there for some quiet time, not to inspect the place. I pulled my car to the front and killed the engine. The silence was the first thing that struck me. No birds, no breeze, nothing. Just stillness. I grabbed my bag from the back seat and walked up to the door. It creaked as I opened it, the hinges dry from years of disuse. Inside, the cabin was exactly what I expected, basic, sparsely furnished. A couch, a small kitchen, a single bed tucked in the corner with a thin quilt. There were a few shelves with some old books and a fireplace against one wall. The air was musty, thick with the smell of wood and dust. The windows were covered with heavy, dark curtains that blocked out any light from the outside. It wasn't unpleasant, but it wasn't cozy either. I threw my bag down onto the bed and started exploring the place, looking for any signs of life or death. There was a small bathroom, a single mirror above the sink, a few towels hanging on a hook. The whole place seemed untouched, as if no one had been there for years. The quiet was almost oppressive. After a while, I decided to step outside and get some fresh air. I needed a break from the stifling atmosphere inside. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the forest. The trees around the cabin were so thick that only a sliver of sky peeked through the gaps. I walked a little ways into the woods, just enough to stretch my legs. The quiet was even more intense out there, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I tried to push the unease out of my mind. I had rented this place because I wanted to get away from the distractions of everyday life. The fact that it was so remote, so empty, was supposed to be a selling point. But as I walked further, I couldn't ignore the strange feeling creeping up my spine. I felt like I was being watched, though I couldn't see anyone or anything. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, and the silence pressed in on me from all sides. I decided to head back to the cabin. As I turned around, something caught my eye, an odd shape in the distance. It wasn't far from the cabin, just past a cluster of trees. I couldn't make out what it was, but it seemed out of place, as though it didn't belong there. My curiosity got the better of me, so I started walking toward it. The closer I got, the more uneasy I became. It was a small, weathered shack, barely visible through the thick trees. There was something about it that felt off. I couldn't explain it, but it was like the air around it was thicker, charged with a kind of heaviness. The shack itself looked abandoned. Its walls were falling apart, and the roof was caved in on one side. It was a miracle it was still standing at all. I stood there for a few moments, staring at it. Something in my gut told me to leave, to turn around and go back to the cabin. But my feet refused to move. Something was pulling me toward it, some deep instinct that I couldn't ignore. I finally stepped closer, careful to avoid stepping on any loose boards or fallen branches. The door of the shack was hanging off one hinge, barely attached to the frame. Inside, I could see remnants of old furniture. A chair, a table, and something that looked like a mattress on the floor. There were no windows, and the inside of the shack was pitch black, even though the sun was still setting. I wanted to leave. I really did, but I couldn't. I stepped inside. My breath echoed in the empty space as I took in the decaying surroundings. Dust filled the air, making it hard to breathe. There was an odd smell in the air too. Something metallic, like blood, but stale and old. As I moved further in, my foot kicked something hard. I bent down and found a rusted metal box, half buried in the dirt. My heart started to race. I reached down and opened it, expecting to find old, worthless trinkets. Instead, there was a thick, worn notebook inside. It looked out of place, like it didn't belong with the other junk in the box. I pulled it out and flipped it open. The first few pages were filled with neat, almost obsessive writing. Notes, dates, names, and places that I didn't recognize. But as I flipped through it, something began to stand out. The entries became more erratic, the handwriting shaky and hurried. The last entry made my stomach churn. Underscore, I can hear them outside now. They know I'm here. I can feel them watching. It's only a matter of time before they come inside. Underscore, I slammed the book shut and jumped back, my heart racing in my chest. I hadn't noticed it before, but the temperature in the shack had dropped significantly. The air felt colder, almost biting. I took one last look at the shack and bolted out the door. As I ran back to the cabin, I could have sworn I heard something. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, following me. By the time I made it back to the cabin, I was shaking. I locked the door behind me and threw the bolt across. I wasn't sure what had just happened, but I knew I didn't want to be anywhere near that shack. The rest of the night was a blur of pacing and anxiety. The silence around the cabin seemed even more oppressive, like it was closing in on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I lay down in bed, staring up at the dark ceiling. The only sound in the cabin was the occasional creak of the wooden walls as the house settled. But then, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard something outside, a faint scraping sound, like something or someone was moving around the cabin. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. I forced myself to stay calm, to reason with myself. It was probably just an animal, a raccoon, or something small. But then the scraping sound stopped, and I heard something else. A low, guttural noise, almost like breathing, but slow and uneven. It was coming from just outside my window. I slowly got out of bed, my body trembling. The curtains were still drawn, but I had to know. I slowly moved toward the window and peered through a small gap between the curtains. What I saw made my blood run cold. There was something standing just outside the cabin. It wasn't human, at least not in the way I understood it. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed to stretch too far. Its skin was pale and thin, like it had been stretched too tight over a skeleton. Its eyes, black and hollow, were staring directly at me through the window. For a long moment, neither of us moved. And then, slowly, it lifted its hand. The fingers were long, unnaturally long, and they tapped against the glass. 3 sharp taps. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. I felt paralyzed, like I was trapped in some kind of nightmare. But then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the thing turned and vanished into the woods, leaving only the deep silence behind. I waited for hours before I dared to move again. But when I finally opened the door and stepped outside, the world was still and calm. No sign of the creature, no footsteps, no sounds. Just the same oppressive quiet I had felt when I first arrived. The next day, I packed my things and left. I didn't stop to take anything with me, not even the strange notebook. I couldn't explain what had happened, and I didn't want to. All I knew was that whatever was out there in those woods, I didn't want to find it again. When I left, the world felt normal again. The silence was still there, but it wasn't oppressive. It was just quiet, and I felt a strange sense of relief wash over me. I wasn't sure if what I had seen was real or if it was some sort of hallucination, but I wasn't going to stay to find out. I never went back to that cabin, and I never looked up the name on the notebook or the strange, twisted entries inside it. Some things are better left forgotten. I had always wanted to spend some time alone, away from the noise of city life, just me and the woods. So when I found a secluded cabin to rent for the weekend, I thought it was the perfect opportunity to disconnect, get some peace, and maybe even clear my head. The cabin wasn't much, small, tucked away on the edge of a forest, but it had everything I needed. There was something about it that felt right. Felt like a place where I could breathe, just be myself. The first day was great. The sun was shining through the trees as I unloaded my things from the car. The air smelled fresh, like pine and earth, and the sound of birds was calming. The cabin was simple. A wooden structure with a few rooms, a small kitchen, a living area with a fireplace, and a loft upstairs. The floors creaked with every step, the way old wood does, but that only added to its charm. I made myself a cup of coffee, sat on the porch with a blanket wrapped around me, and just stared at the view for hours. That evening, I decided to take a walk. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the forest around the cabin seemed to come alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and the occasional snap of a twig. The path near the cabin wasn't well maintained, but it was easy to follow. I kept to it, letting my mind wander, taking in the quiet, the isolation. It was peaceful, But as I ventured deeper into the woods, something began to nag at me. Just a small feeling, almost like I was being watched. I brushed it off. I was alone in the middle of nowhere. There was no one out here, or at least that's what I thought. When I returned to the cabin, it was dark, the moon hanging high in the sky, casting shadows across the yard. The wind picked up, making the trees sway in strange patterns. I stepped inside and locked the door behind me. The inside of the cabin was warm, the fire crackling in the fireplace. I could hear the wind outside picking up speed, causing the wooden walls to creak. The place felt alive. I figured it was just the old wood settling. As I sat by the fire, I began to hear a strange noise, a soft thud, like something tapping against the cabin's walls. At first, I thought it was just the wind again, maybe a branch brushing against the house. But then I heard it again, closer this time, more deliberate. My heart started to race. The fire crackled louder, and I glanced at the windows. Nothing. I tried to shake it off. I stood up, checked the locks on the doors and windows, and looked around the room. Everything was normal. I was just getting paranoid from being alone too long, I told myself. But the noise didn't stop. It continued, tapping against the side of the house like something or someone was gently knocking over and over again. I grabbed a flashlight, my hands shaking slightly, and stepped outside onto the porch. The wind had died down, and the air felt still, almost too still. I shone the beam of light across the yard. Nothing, no movement, but that nagging feeling, the feeling of being watched, was back. I stood there for a long time, listening, my pulse pounding in my ears. Eventually, I convinced myself that I was just being ridiculous. It was probably just an animal, a bird or a squirrel knocking on the cabin. But when I went back inside and tried to sleep, the sound continued.
Top, top, top.
Soft but constant. I covered my head with a pillow and tried to drown it out, but I couldn't. By the time morning came, I hadn't slept at all. I was exhausted, jittery, and had no idea what to make of what had happened. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. The wind, animals, my imagination running wild in the dark. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it, something I wasn't seeing. I spent the next day trying to push it out of my mind. I went for another walk, this time further into the woods, but the forest felt different. The trees were too quiet. There were no animals, no birds chirping, nothing. The silence was oppressive. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something or someone following me. But there was nothing, just the trees, the dirt, and the emptiness. By the time I made it back to the cabin, my nerves were shot. I decided to leave. I wasn't sure why, but the thought of spending another night there had become unbearable. The place, which had seemed so peaceful and inviting when I first arrived, now felt claustrophobic, as though the walls were closing in on me. I gathered my things quickly, ready to get in my car and drive far away. But when I reached the front door, I froze. It was wide open. I was sure I had locked it. I always lock doors behind me. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped inside, flashlight raised, heart hammering. The room looked untouched. The fire had gone out hours ago. I was alone, but the feeling of unease in my chest had turned into something much worse. Pure dread. I checked every room, the closets, the loft. There was no one. But then, I found something that made my blood run cold. In the corner of the kitchen, next to the pantry, was a small, hand-carved figurine. I hadn't seen it before. It was simple, unassuming, a wooden figure of a person with hollow eyes. The carving was rough, jagged even, and it looked as though it had been made in a hurry. I didn't know why it felt wrong, but it did. It felt like someone had been in here and they had left that thing behind as a message. That's when the tapping came back.
Top, top, top.
louder now from behind the walls. My heart leaped in my chest as I spun around, searching the room for any sign of movement. The tapping came from the ceiling now. It was like someone was pacing up there, stepping across the floorboards in the attic. I ran to the stairs, my legs like lead, and shone the flashlight up into the dark loft. There was nothing. I stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of it. There was no way anyone else could have been in the cabin. I had locked the door. The only possible explanation was, well, I didn't know, and the uncertainty terrified me. I didn't waste another second. I grabbed my things, left the figurine on the floor, and ran outside into the woods, back to my car. I didn't even care about the cost of the rental at that point. I just needed to leave. I drove as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached the nearest town, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I never went back to that cabin. And every time I think about it, I remember the feeling I had that night, the feeling of being watched, the tapping, the figurine. I don't know who or what was there or what it wanted, but I don't ever want to find out. The cabin was isolated. I had rented it from an old family friend who lived a few hours away. They spoke about it like it was a gem, nestled in the woods and perfect for unwinding. But when I first arrived, something felt off about it. The cabin was old, the kind of structure that looked as if it had been neglected for years. Its wooden beams groaned in the wind, and there was a layer of dust over everything, even though it wasn't abandoned. I had wanted solitude. My work had become overwhelming, and I thought spending a few days by myself in the wilderness would clear my head. I pulled up to the driveway, the gravel crunching under my tires as I parked. The sun was setting, casting long shadows on the trees that surrounded the cabin. The area was quiet, too quiet. I didn't hear a single bird call. No sounds of wildlife, just the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. I grabbed my bag and stepped out of the car. The air was crisp, but it carried a strange dampness, like something had been sitting stagnant for a long time. I couldn't put my finger on it. It wasn't a bad smell, but it wasn't fresh either. The front door creaked as I opened it, the hinges protesting. Inside, the air smelled like wood and something else, stale, like it hadn't been ventilated in ages. The cabin itself was small but cozy. A stone fireplace sat to the left of the entry, and there was a couch and a few armchairs scattered around a wooden coffee table. The walls were covered in old photographs, black and white images of people I didn't recognize. They were smiling in some, but the smiles felt off, forced in a way that didn't sit right with me. I dropped my bag onto the couch and walked to the window. The view was beautiful, the woods stretching endlessly into the distance. But even then, I could feel that stillness. The world outside was silent, and it felt like the silence was pressing in on me. I tried to shake off the feeling. I came here for peace, and I wasn't going to let my nerves get the best of me. The first night went by uneventfully. I cooked myself a simple meal, watched a bit of TV, and went to bed early. The sounds of the forest outside seemed to get louder as the night wore on. I could hear the wind picking up, the branches scraping against the cabin. It wasn't enough to keep me awake, though. I fell into a deep sleep, the kind where you forget where you are for a while. But the next morning, things started to get strange. When I woke up, I noticed a faint smell. Burnt wood. It wasn't strong, but it lingered in the air, like someone had used the fireplace. The only problem was I hadn't lit a fire. I walked to the living room, my feet making soft thuds on the wooden floor. Nothing seemed out of place. The logs in the fireplace were cold, the ashes untouched. I chalked it up to my imagination and decided to go for a walk outside. The woods were dense. As I wandered, I kept expecting to see some kind of wildlife, a deer, maybe a rabbit, but there was nothing, just trees and the quiet hum of the wind. My footsteps crunched on the fallen leaves, the only sound that broke the stillness. After a while, I found myself near a small stream. It wasn't much, just a trickle of water weaving through the rocks, but the air around it felt different, thicker. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned to head back to the cabin, but as I walked, something caught my eye. A piece of cloth caught on a branch, fluttering gently in the wind. It was an old, tattered rag. I took a step closer, instinctively reaching out to pull it off the branch. The moment my fingers touched it, I heard a snap behind me. I froze, my heart racing. But when I turned around, there was nothing. The woods were empty, the only sound my own breath coming in ragged bursts. I forced myself to shake it off. It was just the wind or an animal, I told myself. There was no one here. Still, something had changed. The air felt thicker, heavier. I hurried back to the cabin, my pace quickening with every step. Once inside, I locked the door behind me and tried to calm myself. The weird sensation of being watched still clung to me, and I couldn't ignore the fact that I hadn't seen a single living creature in the woods. Not even a bird. I spent the rest of the day inside, trying to distract myself with a book. The hours passed in a blur, and soon it was dark again. The air was colder now, and I couldn't stop thinking about the cloth, about the feeling in the woods. I had heard stories about the dangers of getting lost out there, how people could vanish without a trace, how the forest had a way of swallowing you whole. But I wasn't lost. I was fine. I just needed to sleep. That night, I woke up to the sound of scratching. At first, I thought it was a branch against the window, but when I listened closer, I realized it was coming from inside the cabin. My heart stopped. It was soft at first, just a faint noise, but then it grew louder, more deliberate. Someone or something was scratching at the walls. I grabbed my phone, the screen casting a faint glow in the dark room. I checked the time, 2:42 a.m. My hands shook as I dialed the number for the cabin's owner. No answer. I tried again. Nothing. The scratching continued, now accompanied by a faint thumping sound, like someone was pacing back and forth just beyond the walls. I could feel my pulse in my ears, the dread creeping over me like a thick fog. I told myself it was just an animal, a raccoon or something, maybe, but deep down I knew it wasn't. I waited in silence, trying to listen for any other sounds. After what felt like an eternity, the noise stopped. Everything went quiet again, but it wasn't the same as before. The silence felt unnatural, too quiet. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next day, I was exhausted. My mind kept replaying the sounds from the night before. I had to get out of there. But when I went outside to pack up my things, I noticed something strange. The car's tires were flat, all 4 of them, and there was no sign of anything that could have caused it. No nails, no glass, no rocks. Just flat tires, like something had deliberately done it. I was trapped. The panic hit me then. I didn't know what was going on, but I had to get out. I couldn't stay here another minute. I grabbed my phone again, this time calling a tow truck. But again, no answer. I tried again and again, nothing. My mind raced as I looked around. The woods seemed closer now, the trees pressing in on me. I felt like they were closing in, like the walls of the cabin were shifting. I grabbed my bag, determined to hike out to the nearest road. But when I tried to open the door, it wouldn't budge. It was stuck. I pulled, pushed, kicked, but it wouldn't open. I turned around, my eyes scanning the cabin for anything I could use to break the door down. But there was nothing, just old furniture, old pictures, and that heavy, oppressive silence. I started to panic, my breathing shallow and quick. What was happening? What was going on here? That's when I heard it again, the scratching. But this time, it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from inside the cabin, from the attic. I grabbed a chair, stood on it, and tried to push open the attic door. Creaked as I pried it loose. Inside, The space was dark and filled with old, forgotten things. Boxes, dusty furniture, and piles of things I couldn't make out in the dim light. But at the far end, something caught my eye. A figure, someone or something was standing in the shadows just beyond the light. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. And then, slowly, the figure stepped forward. It was a woman. She was tall, thin, with pale skin and wild, unkempt hair. She was wearing an old, tattered dress, like she had been living in the attic for years. But her eyes, they weren't right. They were wide, unblinking, and filled with an emptiness that made my blood run cold. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I could only watch as she took a step toward me, her feet making no sound on the floor. But then, something changed. The cabin didn't feel like it was closing in anymore. The air grew lighter, and the oppressive feeling lifted. The figure stopped moving. She didn't approach me, didn't make a sound. She just stood there, staring. And then, without another word, she turned and walked into the darkness of the attic, disappearing into the shadows. I didn't wait around. I shoved the attic door closed and ran down the stairs out of the cabin into the woods. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, I found the road. The air felt different out there, fresher. The sun was setting again, but this time, I didn't feel alone. The woods were behind me now. Whatever had happened in that cabin stayed there. And as I reached the road, I finally saw a car passing by. I didn't look back. I never thought I'd end up in that cabin. Not in a million years. It was meant to be a simple getaway. A weekend trip to relax, get away from the noise, and be surrounded by nature. But the moment I arrived, I should have known something wasn't right. I remember the drive up. The road was narrow, winding between tall trees, the kind that looked like they'd been standing for centuries. The sky was overcast, a dull gray that matched the mood of the woods. There was a chill in the air, though it wasn't cold enough to make me feel uneasy. Yet, I couldn't shake this nagging feeling that the silence around me was too thick, too heavy. When I finally turned into the gravel driveway leading to the cabin, I noticed how isolated it was. There were no other houses around. Nothing, just trees and more trees. It was as if the cabin was placed in the middle of nowhere on purpose. The kind of place that felt like it could swallow you whole if you weren't careful. The cabin itself wasn't much to look at. It had a rustic charm, I suppose, with its weathered wood and stone chimney, but the porch steps creaked under my weight as I walked up. A strange, sour smell lingered in the air. Old wood, damp, and something else I couldn't place. The door was slightly ajar, like someone had just left. I paused for a moment, wondering if this was normal. I had rented it through an online service, so I hadn't seen it in person before now. When I pushed the door open, the hinges protested with a loud squeak. Inside, the cabin was dim. A single lamp in the corner of the living room barely lit the place up. The furniture was old, mismatched. There was a faded couch with a couple of blankets draped over it, a coffee table that had seen better days, and a fireplace that hadn't been used in years. The smell was stronger inside, making my throat feel tight. I set my bags down by the door and immediately opened the windows to let some fresh air in. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, telling myself I was just being paranoid. The place was fine. I'd settle in, unpack, and everything would be okay. But as I started exploring, I noticed things weren't quite right. Little things that didn't make sense. Like the fact that there was no clock. Not a single one, not even in the kitchen. It felt like time had been suspended in this cabin. There was an old radio sitting on the counter, but it didn't work when I turned it on. The static was so loud that I quickly turned it off, but the silence that followed was even worse. I went to check out the bedroom. It was a small room with a bed covered in a thick, quilted blanket. The bed was solid, but when I ran my hand over the comforter, it felt damp. Not just a little, but noticeably wet. My first thought was that maybe there had been some leak, but there was no water damage on the walls or ceiling. Everything seemed dry except for that bed. The bathroom was equally strange. The mirror was cracked, running from the top to the bottom, splitting my reflection in a way that made me feel off. I couldn't explain it. It was just unsettling. After a while, I decided to go outside for a walk, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. I walked down the narrow path that led through the trees, noticing how the branches seemed to reach out toward me. The whole forest felt dense, like it was closing in around me. I couldn't see much beyond the few feet in front of me. The woods so thick it felt like I was walking in a tunnel. The ground was soft, with layers of fallen leaves and pine needles underfoot. As I walked deeper into the woods, I found a small clearing with a large, flat rock in the center. I sat on it for a while, trying to make sense of the weird feeling I couldn't shake. The breeze had picked up, rustling the leaves in a way that almost sounded like whispers. I couldn't focus on what they were saying, if they were saying anything at all, but it felt like they were talking about me. The wind wasn't exactly cold, but it had a sharp bite to it that made my skin prickle. Then, in the distance, I heard something, a sound that didn't belong. It was the faintest crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. I turned around, but no one was there. I stood up, looking around, and that's when I noticed the faint outline of something moving between the trees. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but then I saw the shape more clearly. It was too tall, too deliberate in its movement. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly backed away. I wasn't sure what I was seeing, but something about it didn't sit right. I turned to head back to the cabin, but as I moved, I kept hearing those footsteps, getting closer with each step I took. The crunch of dry leaves was getting louder, but when I looked behind me again, there was nothing, just the trees. I broke into a jog, not wanting to turn my back, but my legs felt heavy, like they didn't want to move fast enough. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I reached the cabin and slammed the door shut behind me, my breath ragged. My heart was racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something I couldn't explain. The night was coming fast, and I had no intention of leaving the cabin again. I tried to calm myself, but my nerves wouldn't settle. I decided to cook something for dinner, hoping the routine would help distract me. The kitchen was old, but functional. The stove worked fine, and I made myself a simple meal. But as I ate, I couldn't stop glancing out the window. The darkness outside seemed to swallow the forest whole, and I could barely make out the outline of the trees. After dinner, I sat on the couch, turning on the TV, but the static was all I got. That strange, loud static that made my head throb. I turned it off, and the silence returned, almost deafening. That's when I heard it again, the sound of footsteps. This time, they weren't distant. They were right outside the door. I froze, holding my breath. There was no wind, no reason for anyone to be out there. My mind raced, trying to figure out what was going on. Who would be out there, and why? Was someone playing a trick on me? I grabbed the closest thing I could find, an old fireplace poker, and slowly crept to the door. The footsteps stopped. Then came the knock. It was soft at first, like a tap against the wood, but then it came again, louder, more insistent. My hand shook as I reached for the handle, but I didn't open the door. Couldn't. Instead, I stood there listening. The knock didn't come again, but the silence that followed felt like a threat. I stood there for what felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes. Slowly, I backed away from the door, my heart still pounding in my chest. I couldn't understand what was happening. My mind raced through every possible explanation, but none of them made sense. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't tired. Something was wrong. I stayed up for the rest of the night, eyes wide open, my back against the wall. The night passed in a blur of strange sounds and eerie quiet, but no more knocks came, no more footsteps, just the overwhelming silence. By morning, I was exhausted but determined to leave. I grabbed my things, throwing them into my bag in a hurry. I wasn't going to stay another minute in that cabin. As I stepped out onto the porch, the sunlight was blinding after the darkness of the night. I felt a bit of relief, but as I glanced back at the cabin, I noticed something I hadn't before. The porch was covered in small, deep scratches like claw marks, long, jagged lines across the wood. It was clear that they weren't made by any animal. No, these marks were too deliberate, too precise. I didn't want to know who or what had made them, but as I walked down the driveway, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. I don't know what I saw that night or what made those marks, but one thing is for certain, I was never meant to be there.